What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1930s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 30s Project. It's kind of weird because it feels like I've just started the 30s Project, and yeah, we're already in 1935. And it's strange because this is the era where the Hays Code was in full effect. So the horror genre was under a lot harder scrutiny and much more censorship, which is going to affect this year and future years. Which is why, even though we're only halfway through the decade, there's only 2 more episodes after this, covering the entire rest of the decade. But let's check out this episode, and we're about to see 2 guys in particular show up quite a bit. But let's see who shows up more.
This year begins a little later than most, since we're looking at April 26th and the release of Mark of the Vampire. It begins with an old woman in a cemetery being attacked by a very realistic bat, and there's rumors of vampire activity around. A local man is killed and found with what looks like bite marks on his neck, and the doc is convinced it's a vampire at work. There's an inspector on the case, and it's Drew's uncle, Lionel Barrymore. And there's been sightings of a mysterious man named Count Mora around, and they suspect him of being the vamp. When we meet the Count, well, it's certainly a vampire, as it's Dracula himself, Bela Lugosi, and he's with his daughter, Luna, and he has this wound on his forehead, and we'll talk about that in a bit. They're targeting a young woman named Irina, and an occult expert arrives, and it's good old Lionel Atwill again. He's becoming the MVP of the 30s Project, and has just been in just as many entries as either Lugosi or Karloff. Professor Zelen is very keen on trying to get the vampires destroyed, and teams up with Baron Otto and the Inspector to try to stop him from claiming Irina's life. But there's something else at play here, and not everything is as it seems. And this is another one from Todd Browning, director of Dracula, and this would be the reunion of him and Lugosi for the first time since that film. Browning had just had a major bust with Freaks and needed to do something a bit more familiar to get back into good graces with the studio, and he took this on as a safe bet. In fact, it's said to be nearly a shot-for-shot remake of Browning's earlier film, London After Midnight, with Lon Chaney in that iconic makeup, although that film is long lost and only photographs remain. The original run was said to be around 80 minutes, although the version that was released was only around an hour long, leaving 20 minutes of footage unaccounted for. There are several actors listed in the credits who no longer appear in film, as well as an entire subplot explaining that head wound. The script states that Mora had an incestuous affair with his daughter, and in shame committed suicide with a gunshot to the temple. It's unknown if that stuff was actually shot or not, but since it's in the script and it's known that many scenes were cut, it's assumed to be one of the things lost, particularly since it went against the production code standards. This is disputed though, as some historians state that those aspects were never filmed and that a studio would have never allowed scenes such as incest and suicide to be filmed in the first place. It was by MGM, and it was their attempt to get into the horror game that was making Universal so much money at the time, but this didn't quite make the same magic, as it only profited around $50,000, and MGM decided to stay out of the horror biz. And I'm gonna go with a 3 on this one. It's a bit standard and aimless until that fantastic twist ending, which is what boosted it up to a 3. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's got Browning involved, and Lugosi and Atwill, but it's a touch lesser known, but did make a bit of an impact at the time, and is still said to have had a touch of influence on modern meta films. Should you watch it? You should. It'll make a mark. We go now to perhaps this year's highest profile release, which occurred a little while later on May 6th, and we've already got some Lugosi, so let's get some Karloff with The Bride of Frankenstein. This begins with Lord Byron and Mary Shelley's husband on one fateful night, and Mary Shelley is here too, and they're commending her for writing Frankenstein. She says that she has more to tell. She starts to tell the story, and we pick up right where the last one left off. And remember that poor father who had his little girl drowned by the monster in the last one? You know, that poor guy? Well, I guess screw him in particular because he's the one who discovers that it's still alive and survived the windmill fire and strangles him and then kills his wife as well. Henry is taken back home to his new wife Elizabeth and is soon visited by Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger of the Old Dark House and The Ghoul. The doc has heard of Henry's experiment and wants to partner up on further ones.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
And he shows off his creations, little homunculus people, and declares that they should make a woman, a mate for the monster. Meanwhile, he's captured by the townsfolk, but escapes and ends up in the home of a kindly blind man before finding Pretorius and preparing for his bride to be created. And this, of course, is the sequel to Frankenstein, and Universal was just itching to do one. In fact, in the original, the ending was meant to have Henry die, but they changed it to allow for a follow-up. They asked James Whale to return, but he didn't want to, and they considered having Kurt Newman do it, but he did the Black Cat instead, which we covered in the last episode. After that, the studio went hard after Whale again due to his success on The Invisible Man, and he relented, choosing to make it what he referred to as a memorable hoot in order to top the original. One cast member that couldn't return was Mae Clarke as Elizabeth, since she had recently been in a car accident that left her with a broken jaw and facial scarring. She was replaced by Valerie Hobson. The shoot was troubled since Colin Clive was battling with alcoholism at the time and his condition had worsened, even though Whale thought that it improved his performance as it made him come off as more agitated. Clive also broke a leg shortly before filming, which is why so many scenes feature him either sitting or laying down. The cinematographer John Mescal also had drinking issues, and they had to have him escorted around set continuously. By this time, the Hays Code was in full effect and enforcement, and it had an effect here, as they had to censor several scenes in order to get approval. Upon release, it was well received and did quite well at the box office, and was even nominated for an Academy Award, although for sound recording. Since then, it's only grown in regard and is now frequently considered the best of the Universal slate, and an improvement on the original film, showing up on a number of greatest film of all time lists. And I love this one. It's a 4.5 from me. But what a great film this is. Although I think I'm more partial to the original, but it's really close. But it has great characters, it's amazingly well shot, and a deeper storyline than you'd expect. Its significance is also a 4.5 since it's hugely known, one of the most popular franchises in horror, and the only reason it's not a 5 is that it's a sequel and part of its significance is due to the original. Should you watch it? I mean, do I think you should watch it? I do.
She's alive! Alive!
A mere 1 week later, another Universal horror entry would be released, bringing yet another monster legend to the screen on May 13th with Werewolf of London. It begins in Tibet, or actually Vasquez Rocks, which is right here in California, and I've done a few different videos there. Wilfred here is on the hunt for a rare flower that is said to only bloom in the moonlight. He heads off into a forbidden valley and finds it, but is then attacked by a man-like creature. He goes back home and, while at a party, is approached by Dr. Yagami. And this is pretty wild because he's meant to be Asian, and he's played by Warner Oland, a Swedish-American man who has no Asian lineage at all. Although he claimed to have some Mongolian ancestry, even if that was never substantiated. It's wild because this is not the only film in which he'd play an Asian character, and most of the roles that he held were. He'd star as Charlie Chan in 16 films, played Fu Manchu multiple times, and many, many others. Yagami tells Wilfred that he's a werewolf now, and I don't know, maybe it's me, but I believe that there may be a bit of subtext. This older man is telling him that he went to Tibet had an encounter with a man-like creature and now is different, and that he knows he's different now, making sure to touch him and get in close. Sure enough, he's right, and we get our first werewolf transformation scene, and yep, this is officially the first feature-length werewolf film. By this point, Universal's horror staples were in full swing, and it seemed like a lycanthrope would be the next obvious direction to go. Originally, they wanted Karloff to play Wilfred and Lugosi to be Yagami, but since Bride was filming at the same time, they recast both parts. They brought on Jack Pierce, the makeup artist who created the Frankenstein monster, and his original take on the werewolf was more bestial and wolf-like, but they decided to go with a scaled-back and more humanoid look instead. Stuart Walker was the director, although his filmography is rather limited, and there's not much horror on it. In fact, he would only do one more movie after this, and then produce a few, and then passed away in 1941. It was decently received, and it did make money, but it wasn't anywhere close to the success that they were hoping from it, although they'd give it another shot at the werewolf concept a few years later with the much more successful Wolfman. And I'm giving this a 3.5. It's still pretty enjoyable, but just not as interesting as the later entry, and feels more Jekyll and Hyde than it does werewolf. Its significance is a 4, since this is the first werewolf film, a Universal entry, and created the rules for pretty much every other wolf movie, but it's not higher because when people think of classic Universal werewolf, this is not the guy that they're picturing. Should you watch it? Yep, do not wait for a full moon. Fast forward now to July, and on the 8th we get another film from Universal as they had a really busy year, and this is The Raven. It begins with a car crash, and Jean gets put in the hospital, and she's Irene Ware, who we last saw back in Shandu the Magician. They need a reclusive retired neurosurgeon to operate on her, and it's Bela Lugosi once again, and he kicks off this appearance by quoting Poe's tale. He's convinced to come back to operate on Jean, but then forms an unhealthy attachment to her. But then another big gun strolls in, and it's Karloff, so the pair now have 2 appearances for the year, but it's the first to feature the both of them since The Black Cat, another Poe adaptation. Bateman is an escaped convict, and he wants Volin to operate on him and give him less of an ugly face. Instead, the doc disfigures him and says that he'll restore his face if he does his bidding. Another Poe story is incorporated as we have the pit and the pendulum here as well, and the two commence a game of cat and mouse as Volin tries to get him to kidnap Jean and claim her for himself. And this one was from Lou Landers, and it was pretty early on in his career, but he'd go on to do much, much more, although not a lot of it was horror. He did work with Lugosi again in 1943 with The Return of the Vampire, and in the 50s made a hard shift into TV directing. This was the third film of Universal's Poe trilogy, following Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Black Cat. All 3 would feature Lugosi, and Karloff was in the last 2. Like The Black Cat, this is extremely far removed from the source material, and again, like that one, is credited as having been suggested by Poe's story as opposed to adapting it. Even though Karloff got top billing, Bela was featured here far more and was actually paid far less. Karloff got 10 grand as opposed to Bela's 5, further firing up the feud between the two. The film had to make some changes before filming due to the strict standards of the production code, and Bateman's operation was forbidden to show any scenes, and they had to tone down the script. Even with that, it was dubbed a gruesome movie and banned in several countries, including the UK. They even went so far as to say that The Raven would be the last horror film that would pass the British Board of Film Censors. It was actually not that well received and was called a bit of an insult to Poe, but did well enough at the box office, even though it wasn't a huge hit. Of course, the short story would be adapted later on several more times with varying degrees of accuracy, as would The Pit and the Pendulum. And I enjoy the hell out of this, but maybe because it's given me a good amount of the 2 horror stars going at it, I'll give it a 3.5. Sure, it could move a little faster, and it's held back by the code, but it's still a trip. Its significance is a 3 since it's a Poe adaptation and has the two big guns, but it's not one of the more well-known films or versions of this or the Universal slate. Should you watch it? Yes. May the time you haven't be nevermore.
Do I look different?
Just a few days later, on July 12th, there was a different kind of horror unveiled as we check out Mad Love, which gives us a young actress named Yvonne. And she has a dedicated fan named Dr. Gogol, played by Peter Lorre, his first appearance on the project that's more of a horror flick since his previous films featured here were M and The Man Who Knew Too Much, more crime thrillers. Yvonne's husband is a piano virtuoso, and they're intending to take off together to England. And when Gogol finds this out, he gets pretty creepy, as if bald Peter Lorre could get creepier, I guess. And then he purchases a full-size wax figure of her. Yvonne's hubby, Stephen, played by Dr. Frankenstein himself, looking quite different here, is on the train home. But it crashes, and his hands are mangled. The doctor recommends amputation, but she remembers Gogol and takes him there, and he uses the hands of an executed murderer. The operation is a success, but it takes all of their money, and Stephen is unable to play the piano. But then the problems begin as the hands start to show signs of their former knife-throwing owner, kicking off his downfall, all according to Gogol's plan. Or is it? And this is another entry from Karl Freund, director of The Mummy and parts of Dracula. It was actually the last film that he would direct before he returned to his main focus, cinematography, and he'd keep going in that role until the early 50s. This was an adaptation of a novel called The Hands of Orlac and served as Lorre's first American film. He had been in German and British films before this, and now was officially a part of Hollywood, even if at this point his English was still a bit rough. Filming was rough as well, as Freund was more interested in the cinematography than actually directing, and the Hays Code was breathing down their necks to make sure that they didn't include any violent scenes, particularly the aftermath of the train wreck. To perhaps capitalize on its salacious nature, the poster was adorned with the phrase, "suitable only for adults," although this was well before any sort of rating system, and it passed the code, so this was more for promotional purposes than an actual warning. It wasn't well received at all, and even though they would praise Lorre's performance, it was panned. It didn't do too well with ticket sales either, since it cost around $400,000 to make and only earned around $350,000. However, more recent reviews have been far more positive, with more regard towards the performances and the story. It even got a remake in 1960 called The Hands of Orlac and had Christopher Lee in it. And this is pretty good stuff here. I'm going with a 3.5. It's a weird story that's a bit all over the place, but man, does it give you some wild twists in the final 15 minutes for a film from the 30s. Its significance is just a 2.5 though, since it's still a very cult picture and never really gained that larger following, but it's Lorre's first US flick, Freund's last, and had Colin Clive in there as well. Should you watch it? 100%. This love isn't exactly all that mad.
He put it back.
Just a few days later, there was yet another release because July was all about horror in 1935, and on the 15th, there was The Black Room. We begin in an old castle in the late 1700s, and a baron is told that he's just had twins, but the family legend is that the family began with one twin killing the other, and a prophecy states that will happen again in the castle's Black Room. They suggest sealing up the room so that there is no more Black Room and the prophecy can't happen, and it jumps ahead several years. Their parents die, and then it jumps ahead 20 more years, and one of the twins is now the Karloff for his third appearance this year. And man, Boris was busy. He hasn't seen his brother in 10 years, and he's got a reputation for being a jerk. Anton returns home, also played by Karloff, and his brother is very paranoid about people trying to kill him. Tensions are immediately high between the twins, and Gregor kills a servant, so the townspeople storm the castle, and he renounces his title to his brother. This kicks off a game of wits as Gregor reveals that he's reopened the Black Room, and betrayal and mistaken identity awaits. And this is yet another one from Roy William Neill, who we've already seen twice in 1934, and he had previously done The Ninth Guest and Black Moon. It's likely the last that we'll see of him for a while though, since all of the rest of his 30s output were crime and comedy. This was a rare horror flick from Columbia Pictures, and it's said that they were trying to make this look more like Paramount's pictures, given its more lavish stylings and bigger cast. Oddly, the film was promoted with a series of photos that showed Karloff holding the servant woman in bondage, tied up with ropes and shackles, but no such scenes are featured in the film. It's thought that there might have been footage that didn't make the finished piece, but historians have suggested that that's not the case, and that they were more likely done for promotion. But there's also a theory that Karloff had a contract clause that demanded a scene in his films featuring a woman in submission to him, and since there were no such moments in this one, they shot the photos to fulfill that clause. It does not appear to have been a hit at all, although Karloff's double performance was praised. And I'll praise it too. He's pretty great here, and I'll give this a 3. It's a decent film that just doesn't do too much out of the ordinary, but it's entertaining, and its significance is just a 2 since it's not that well known and didn't really impact the genre, but it did have 2 Karloffs. Should you watch it? Sure, this room is worth a visit. A little later in July, and we have another one that is not horror and should not be on this list. And I know that some will comment that, but it's worth inclusion because on July 31st, The 39 Steps was released. It begins with a live performance by a man named Mr. Memory, and his shtick is that he memorizes up to 50 facts a day and can answer whatever trivial question you ask him. Gunshots break up the show, and Richard Hannay meets a woman outside and takes her home. She says that she was the source of the gunshots, and she's a spy who has discovered an enemy agent's plot and is now being sought after by assassins, and he's now wrapped up in it. She says that it's all about the 39 steps, and that the villain is a man missing a part of his finger. That night, she's killed, but is holding a map that Richard then decides to try to follow. Along the way, he encounters intrigue and a touch of romance and ends up in the Scottish Highlands, takes up with a man out there, and immediately starts hitting on his much younger wife. Soon, he locates that man missing his finger and finds that the spy game isn't as easy as he had hoped. And my reasoning for including this one is that it's from Alfred Hitchcock, and as one of the masters of horror, I thought it would be of note to include where his career stemmed from and mark his history. It was loosely adapted from a novel from John Buchan, also called The 39 Steps, only maintaining a handful of moments and then diverging wildly from the rest. This was before Hitch had made his move to American productions, and it was a British company called Gaumont British that produced it, but they were looking to push into the American market, and this movie was where they wanted to do that. It was a bigger budget than the director had previously had access to, and it was used to draw some name talent. And whereas his previous film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, became a big international success, this would top it. It was critically acclaimed and became a financial success, and has only grown in regard over time, and is often called the kickoff of escapist cinema. There would be several other adaptations of the book, although several were more remakes of this film than they are alternate adaptations, but there was one in 1959, 1978, and also 2008. And this is also a 4.5 from me. Anyone who thinks that old movies are boring need to check this one out. It's moving a mile a minute and has a good mix of laughs and action to keep it going, and you can see Hitchcock starting to develop the auteur that he would become. Its significance is a 4 since it's certainly influential and key to Hitchcock's greater fame, but it's not horror and never became the household name his other works did. Should you watch it? Absolutely. Great stuff here.
Here, hold this.
Oh, yes.
We are moving into the latter half of the year now, and we're going to September 24th for a much less known release, The Crime of Dr. Crespi. The Doc is a pretty exclusive guy and not the most pleasant man to work for, and he's played by Eric von Stroheim, and he would later become known for being in Sunset Boulevard, and One of the doctors under his employ is Fritz himself, Dwight Fry, who we did see earlier this year very briefly in Bride of Frankenstein as well. His ex-girlfriend comes to see him because her new husband was greatly injured in a car accident, and she pleads with him to operate and save his life. He agrees, but his jealousy gets the best of him, and even though the surgery seems to go okay, shortly afterwards they declare him dead. But then, Crespi moves in on Estelle, just before it's revealed what exactly the crime of Dr. Crespi was. It seems that he's invented some sort of new drug that makes it appear as if a person is dead, but they still retain all of their senses. So, Dr. Ross is fully aware of everything that Crespi is doing and saying, but unable to talk or move or do anything about it. And this one was by John H. Auer, and this was a very early work for him, only his third film, and his first in English, but he didn't do much in the horror realm, or even horror adjacent. Most of his films were musicals or crime dramas, and this could somewhat fall into that latter territory, but it has horror elements going on. On the poster, it very boldly claims to be Edgar Allan Poe's The Crime of Dr. Crespi, and is said to be based on the Poe story The Premature Burial. However, much like the other Poe adaptations that have been featured on the project so far, it can only be described as very loosely based, in that the original story involves a man who seems dead but still had his senses, and the comparisons end there. And this one's fine, I guess, but there's just not much to it, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a 2. The ending is pretty cool, but holy crap does it take time getting there. Its significance is just a 1, since it's virtually unknown, and were it not for Dwight Fry, it doesn't have much in the way of horror stars. Should you watch it? You can skip this one.
Mommy, are we going back to see Daddy?
We're in October now, and on the 1st, we get one that might just surprise you because it's Murder by Television. And I know that we don't all think of television being a thing in the 30s, but it was invented in 1927, even if it didn't become commonplace for a few decades. There's this scientist named Dr. Hoffland, and he's invented a new way to send television signals instantly anywhere in the world. And of course, the new TV companies are interested. However, he's not looking to sell, which upsets the big business guys, and then they call in Bela Lugosi for his 3rd appearance of the year, matching that of Karloff. They do a live demonstration where they show the device in effect, but during it, Hoffland drops dead. The police then have to investigate all of the suspects present to try to solve the murder, and what's interesting here is that much like The Black Room, this has Lugosi playing twin roles, as twin brothers. And, much like that film, one twin is good and the other is evil. So it's interesting that these two heavy hitters of the industry, who were somewhat bitter rivals, would do 2 similar features within such a short period of time. The director was Clifford Sanforth, and this was actually his first film, but he would only direct 4 features overall. After that, he continued on as a producer for a while, but then was no longer in the industry, and nothing else that he was associated with seems to be horror related. This one is somewhat notable for another screen legend with Hattie McDaniel, most known for playing Mammy in Gone with the Wind, and like usual, she's the comic relief here and also a silly stereotype, but she plays it really well and steals every scene that she's in. And it's strange that this movie was able to predict the concept of internationally broadcast television signals decades before that would become a reality. And this is a clunker. It's a 1.5 for me, and it's very slow and dull, only saved occasionally by Lugosi and McDaniel. Its HCS is the same since it's very unknown and never spoken of, but it did have Lugosi, and his presence alone is worth a 0.5. Should you watch it? You can change this channel easily.
There's nothing to be nervous about, Isabella.
That's what you think, sir. But you ain't been listening to Chinese death and disaster symbol since Mr. Howland died. All this excitement ain't too much for my heart.
This year ends in England, actually, on November 14th, with a film that would get an American run in late 1936, and it's Phantom Ship, although the original British title is The Mystery of the Mary Celeste. It begins with a ship called the Mary Celeste, and then we meet Captain Briggs here, and he wants to marry Sarah, but another man, Captain Jim, has also asked her to marry him. And geez, this girl really likes boat captains, I guess. So she's forced to choose between them, and she decides to marry Briggs. There's then a down and out soldier named Anton, and hey, what do you know? It's Bela Lugosi again for his 4th showing this year. So he wins in terms of being in the most movies this year, I suppose, and he's sporting a really different look here. He's recruited to go on Briggs's ship, and even though he's on the edge of a total breakdown, and before they sail, Briggs tries to mend fences with Moorhead, but Jim's not all about that and instead pays another soldier to make sure that Briggs doesn't return alive. After they set sail, dark things start to happen that include murder, and pretty soon most of the crew is dead or vanished. And what's weird is that this one is based on a sort of a true story. There was an actual ship called the Mary Celeste, and it was found in the ocean with no passengers and completely abandoned back in 1872. This movie is a sort of a fictional tale of what might have gone on there. It was actually from Hammer Films and was one of their earliest productions, only their second one, and they'd only make 4 films in the whole decade before kicking into higher gear in the late 40s. The director was a man named Denison Clift, and it would turn out to be his final directorial effort, although he had been making films since 1920 and would continue on for a while as a writer. The version that I watched for this is the Phantom Ship version, and is purportedly around 20 minutes shorter than the original UK version, which had a framing device of a maritime courtroom sequence talking about the investigation into what happened. But that version appears to be lost. And this is decent. I'll give it a 2.5. It's a little slow, but it has some interesting parts, but maybe not enough meat on its bones to really stick with you. Its significance is a 1.5 again, since it's very unknown and not much impact came from it, but Lugosi being there earns it an extra boost. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's decent, but I mean, it's not the best watch.
I was shanghaied, flogged by the mate, thrown to the hold, alive with rats.
So there you have it, all of the horror of 1935. And my favorite of this block, very easily, is going to be Bride of Frankenstein. It's one of the best horror films of the 30s in general. It's one of the best of the Universal lot, and quite possibly one of the greatest horror films of all time. Go check it out. But let me know down below which is your favorite of this block. Let me know which of these you have seen or haven't seen, and which you'd like to see again. Hit the like button. Hit subscribe if you enjoy the channel and enjoy the project. And of course, check out the Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this project. And yeah, as I said, there's only 2 more episodes to go, and then we're going to close out the entire decade right here on the 30s Project.